About a month ago, IGN released 2 controversial reviews, one for Bungie's polarizing extraction shooter Marathon, and one for the heavily hyped action RPG Crimson Desert. Marathon received a 9 and Crimson Desert received a 6, causing some strong backlash against reviewer Travis Northup, who reviewed both games. I'll be honest that a lot of the discourse around these 2 games and their critical reception has kind of bummed me out and reminded me that maybe we need to reassess how we interact with reviews in the first place. In fact, ever since these 2 reviews dropped, I can't stop thinking about IGN. I thought I'd start out first by referencing some of the comments on each of these videos. I'll acknowledge that while yes, these are cherry-picked, I scrolled through the top 50 comments on each video and roughly sorted them into categories based on their positivity or negativity. Note that some comments are able to fit into multiple categories and some comments didn't fit into either, hence why the total can be more or less than 50. In the Marathon review, 33 of the first 50 comments were positive about Marathon, 12 were negative against IGN, and 6 of them mentioned Crimson Desert. So keeping that ratio in mind, here are 6 positive comments about Marathon, 2 negative against IGN, and 1 that mentions Crimson Desert. Note that I've blacked out the names, not to make it difficult for people to check my work, but because I don't want anyone sending hate to any of these individuals. So here's a few of the negative ones. First one says, 9 out of 10. Yes, the same 9 they gave to Dragon Age Veilguard. Next one says, this review is going to age like milk in a desert. I think that one might be a Crimson Desert reference too, not sure. Third one says, nice that you reviewed this game way after launch and fixes whilst you reviewed a pre-launch version of Crimson Desert. And a very nice little smiley emoji. Then here we got some of the positive ones. First one says, the first game that made me feel addicted since Elden Ring. Then we have, this game was not on my radar, but after watching some videos, I took a chance and bought it. Already put over 80 hours in. It's one of the best multiplayer games I've ever played. Third one says, this game is addictive and fun. Never thought I'd like extraction game. And we got a few more here. First one says, one of the best multiplayer games in years. It's amazing. Another one that says, this game absolutely rocks. The gunplay, the vibes, the style, the loop, immaculate. I honestly didn't think an extraction shooter could hook me like this, but man, this one's got the sauce. Third one says, was pleasantly surprised by this one. I've been absolutely loving it. All right, and then for the Crimson Desert review, 21 of the first 50 comments were positive about the game. 24 of the first 50 were negative about IGN, and only 1 mentioned Marathon. So doing my best to keep this ratio in mind, I will show you 4 positive comments, 5 negative comments, and for fun, then we'll look at the 1 Marathon comment as well. So first positive comment we have says, haven't had this much fun on a single player game since Skyrim. Then we have, haven't been able to put it down, 9 out of 10 for me. You know it's a good game when you're playing nonstop until 3 a.m. and have to get up for work at 6 a.m. I like that one a lot. And then 10 years from now, people will still find something new from this game. All right, now for our negative comments. First one says, I guess Pearl Abyss did not pay. Second one we have says, you cannot type ignorant without IGN. You know it's a good game when IGN give 6 out of 10 score. Remember, IGN gave She-Hulk a 9 out of 10. And then in IGN's defense, perhaps 6 is as high as they can count. That one's actually pretty funny, though. Oh, yeah, and then we got the 1 Marathon comment as well that says, keep in mind this is the same dude that reviewed Marathon, Concord, Highguard, and is mad that CD is doing better than any of them. So what is my takeaway from all this? Well, I think it's pretty clear that people seem to not like IGN. Even when there is a positive review, people still are posting negative comments about 20% of the time. That's not to say that negative comments are never justified, but I think a lot of these are coming at it from the wrong angle. Throughout the rest of this video, I hope to make you reflect on how you interact with reviews and how you perceive larger review outlets like IGN. And in summary, I hope we can be a bit kinder to each other and contribute more positively to online discussions. So let's just get one thing out of the way. I am not here by any means to defend a $650 million company because I am some huge IGN fan. I'm more concerned about how we treat individuals on the internet, as well as overall how we can offer feedback and criticism. So let's start out on a positive note and take a look at some of the better comments on that Crimson Desert video to highlight what I think is a good way to interact with a review that you disagree with. So a couple of these are from earlier as well, but just to reiterate, haven't had this much fun on a single player game since Skyrim. Haven't been able to put it down, 9 out of 10 for me. And a new one, game is phenomenal. It also went from mixed to very positive on Steam, likely because of the speedy patch fixes and because many people found out that you need to push past the opening few hours to start having fun. And unlike most open world games, this game actually gets better the more you play. So I think these comments are great because they're offering their own perspective, right? One commenter is comparing it to Skyrim. That can be some helpful context. Another saying it's a 9 out of 10, right? Offering their own score. And that last one, offering some encouragement to new players that maybe they're having some struggles with the negative parts of the game and encouraging them to push past it. Now, to contrast, let's take a look at some of the comments that I find to be a little bit less helpful. So this first one here, this one's from before. It says, I guess Pearl Abyss did not pay. Now, let me be clear and say that I know a lot of these comments are just poking fun, maybe not meant to be taken so seriously. However, I think that people genuinely do believe these things to be true. This first comment insinuates that IGN gets paid for their reviews, and I think it's maybe even implying that the Marathon review is paid for, given that Travis reviewed both these games, and there are a few comments on that Marathon video that claim that Bungie paid for that positive score. And I think that is kind of destructive to the conversation as it questions the integrity of both the reviewer and the review company. Again, not to say IGN's perfect, but if you can't even trust that a reviewer is reviewing a game in good faith, then the conversation kind of ends there. Again, I know this is just a joke, but this is a pretty serious accusation with no evidence for it other than the scores. All right, next one we got, again, this one's from earlier. It says, it's a good game when IGN gives 6 out of 10 score. This one, there are a lot of variations of something that implies that IGN's low score games are actually good and their high score games are bad. But here's another one for a good measure. This one says, I still base my purchases on IGN reviews. High score equals don't buy, low score equals buy. So again, I know these are just poking fun, so allow me a moment to poke some fun as well. Let's look at a couple games that this commenter should certainly avoid based off of IGN's high scoring. So first one we got Elden Ring, that was scored a 10, should probably avoid that one. Then we got Baldur's Gate 3, also a 10, definitely gonna wanna skip that. Breath of the Wild, Red Dead 2, Last of Us, GTA 5, all 10s, all skips, skip all those. And then why not, let's throw out a couple games that this commenter would likely love based on their comments. So we got Gollum, that one got a 4. That one's probably awesome. Mind's Eye, also a 4. That game's probably great. You'd love that one. And then Redfall, we all know that one rules. That one got a 4. You'd probably love that one too. So my point overall is that there are a lot of people criticizing IGN for having both bad negative reviews and bad positive reviews. And I'm going to try, at least in good faith, to understand where that sentiment comes from, and then I'll talk about why I think we should shift our perspective a little bit on how reviews are handled. This one is one of the more infamous IGN reviews, as it's for a Pokemon game, which I think is always going to be controversial, but more specifically for its strange metric that deducts points. Too much water. Now, I think it's a silly comment to make and maybe a silly thing to deduct points for, but the point I think is fairly defensible. The reviewer claims that there's too much surfing in these games, so like these big watery areas which can be kind of tedious to explore, and then apparently there are too many water-type Pokemon later on in the game. I don't play these games too much, so I can't measure if that's accurate. Are there too many water-type Pokemon? Is there too much surfing? I don't know for sure, but it sounds like a pretty defensible claim. At worst, I think this is just a funny shorthand for what is pretty defensible criticism. Nothing too reputation damaging here. So this game received a 7.1 from IGN. I found this one on a Reddit thread about the worst IGN reviews of all time. And one thing that I'll get to later that I thought was funny was the comment that replied to this says, that's my favorite Doom so far. I would at least give it an 8.5. Like, I don't know. Like, I feel like a 7.1 and an 8.5 aren't that different, honestly. Like, I feel like subjectivity can pretty easily explain a 1.4 point gap, but we'll get back to that later. So this game was reviewed by 2 separate people, actually. One from the UK who gave it a 9, and one from the US who gave it a 2. So pretty big gap, obviously. The person in the US criticized it for not having traditional soccer gameplay like FIFA, which obviously this game is not supposed to be FIFA. It's not supposed to be anything like that. So yeah, that's a bad review. I think that's fair. That's a bad one. So this review for Dead Cells eventually came out to be plagiarized, which is bad. And it has since been removed and replaced with a genuine review. So for me anyways, I think this is personally, more of a plight on this reviewer than it is on IGN. Of course, IGN should be vetting these reviews and should be proofreading them, etc. But at the same time, you trust your employees to do their job correctly, and that's just part of the relationship. And overall, I think IGN handled this situation well, right? Like, the reviewer's been fired and a genuine review has been put in its place. Aside from these, there aren't too many reviews out there that I could find online that have received like an exceptional amount of backlash. I think Alien Isolation was one of them as well. But I think overall, I've made my point that this could be explained by something that I think we all know, but maybe sometimes forget, which is that IGN is a massive company that employs many different reviewers. You know, there really isn't such a thing as IGN reviews, right? The only thing that all IGN reviews have in common is that they are hosted on IGN, and there are plenty of good reviews, as we talked about before, out there on their site. So let's return to the Crimson Desert review to close out this video, and we could talk about how I think we are all interacting with reviews in the wrong way. In my opinion, one of the worst things about video game reviews is the 10-point scale. I understand why it exists, and I think it's possible to interact with it in a healthy way, but almost no one, including me sometimes, does. The 10-point scale is inherently ambiguous because it's not clear what those middle scores mean exactly. Things like 4s, 5s, 6s, and 7s are a bit unclear. 1s are clearly as bad as possible, and 10s are clearly as good as possible. So is a 6 a positive score? I would argue yes, but is a 60% a good grade on an exam or something? Well, maybe that depends on your perspective. To me, a review score is nothing without the context, and I think leaving room for subjectivity is important to calibrate a review to your own score. Any one reviewer's numbered review for a game is only going to measure their own subjective enjoyment, and it's important to look at the context to know if that score is going to be higher or lower for you based on what you like in a game. So let's look at Crimson Desert again and look at the main critiques offered in that review. The first critique, I think, can be summarized as the game tries to do too many things and lacks a single focus. Travis says, and while it's genuinely impressive that developer Pearl Abyss even attempts to smash all these things I love into a single package, the result ends up being a jack of all trades but a master of none. So this is a pretty common critique of Crimson Desert that I've seen from other reviewers as well. So we know this experience is at least somewhat shared online. But this might not be a bad thing for you. Some of my favorite games are all over the place, filled with mini games and side content. So maybe already this game could be a bit more than a 6 to you. So let's say you don't mind this. Let's bump it up to a 6.5 for your own personal score. The next critique from Travis I think can be summarized as bad story and bad dialogue. Travis says the dialogue, characters, and story are laughably bad. He also says the story is aimless, the characters are forgettable across the board. This is another pretty common critique of the game that I've seen. So again, we know that this is at least somewhat a shared experience. Even the studio's own CEO would go on to say, quote, "We do agree to some extent with the disappointment users feel about the story. We also wish we could have done it better." So even the CEO agrees that the story could be better. So I think it's fair to say again that this seems like a pretty defensible criticism. But again, just because an argument is defensible doesn't mean that you have to agree with it. I'm a huge Souls game fan, and those games have virtually zero story as well. Maybe you're like me and you don't play ARPGs for the story. So maybe this criticism doesn't apply to you either. So let's bump your score up to a 7 now. The third main criticism I think can be summarized as controls and button mapping are overly complicated. Travis says, quote, "The control mapping is completely insane by default." He also says, "The control mapping requires you to remember various multi-step button combinations to access abilities you have to use all the time." Yet again, this is a pretty common complaint that I've seen for this game, and again, seems to be a pretty defensible take. But maybe you are an expert gamer that has a lot of familiarity with strange button layouts, and you don't mind this. So let's again bump your own score up for this game to a 7.5. All right, let's do one more. So I think the last one can be summarized as unintuitive puzzles. Travis simply says, puzzles are unintuitive and janky. I know this is purely anecdotal, but again, another criticism that I've heard from other reviewers. It seems defensible enough. Maybe you don't mind this as much, and maybe we should bump your score up one more time to an 8.0. So this is obviously not a perfect example, and we of course can't say, oh yes, bad story takes off exactly half a point, and therefore if you don't mind a bad story, you add half a point to the score, now you got your own score. It's not an exact science. But earlier I said I think it's fair to leave enough room for subjectivity when judging a review, maybe like 1.5 points or so. We've looked at a few of the main criticisms offered in this Crimson Desert review, and I personally think that, yeah, they're all defensible enough. Nothing is too crazy here. But I also know that it's unlikely for these things to bother me personally. So maybe I add on a couple points to the review score, leave enough room for subjectivity, plus or minus 1.5, meaning based on this review, I think Crimson Desert is likely to be between a 6.5 and a 9.5, at least for me personally, right? And sure, that's a wide range. I haven't played the game yet. It would be crazy for me to know exactly how good I think the game is based on someone else's experience. And look, we can do the same sort of science in the other direction with Marathon. Sure, Travis gives it a 9, but maybe you don't like shooters, maybe you don't like extraction games, maybe you hate losing progress. Well, then the game is probably a lot lower than a 9 for you. My main point is that people are clowning on this review while at the same time completely missing the point of reviews in the first place. This review is here so you can say, okay, if this is a 6, and it's a 6 for these reasons, but those reasons don't bother me, then I know now that I'm likely to think that this game is higher than a 6. And it goes both ways too. If you watch the Marathon review and the highlights that make it a 9 to Travis don't really appeal to you, well, then it's probably going to be a bit lower than a 9 for you. So anyways, I'm just a little tired of seeing IGN articles pop up with unconstructive comments or negative remarks aimed at the reviewers. Games and our enjoyment of them is subjective, and reviewers are doing their best to give us their opinions so we can overlay it to our own experiences and tastes and make an informed decision as consumers. And I'm personally excited to pick up Crimson Desert and give it a try, in spite of the low score from IGN. Not because they're wrong, but because if they're right, then I know it'll be a great time for me. Thanks for watching.